All right, so I'm going to talk about our transition from a really horrible, there's nobody here that wrote it, I don't think I can get, so a really horrible backbone jQuery CoffeeScript app. Sorry, CoffeeScript fans, but over to React and Redux. Most of the team, so first disclaimer, 3 things here. 1, I might swear a bit. 2, there's a lot of animated GIFs from anime. I apologize for any non-anime fans. But most importantly, everything's an opinion. There's tons of opinions in the React and Redux world. I know a lot of us like to think that we're right about a lot of things, but the reality is it's different for every project. Things I'm going to say in this may apply to you, may not apply to you. Feel free to boo and hiss at me if you don't agree, but the reality is as we've discovered, and you'll see in this talk, there's a lot of good information, a lot of bad information, and a whole lot in between that is very situational, and if you don't take the time to figure out what you actually need, you're going to make a lot of the same mistakes we did. So, awesome. So Bleach Report supports over 70 million users, so no pressure on this project. Basically, for any of you, how many people have actually used Bleach Report, the app or the website? Okay, good, a decent amount of you. So everything that ends up in the app has to go through the tools that were rebuilt in React. So we have a team on the 6th floor of this building whose job it is to grab articles, tweets, Instagram posts, et cetera, from all over the internet. They stick it into our tool, and then some algorithms do their thing, and that's what you end up seeing in the app. So it's not, as a lot of people think, a simple WordPress blog that we throw into an iOS app and show you some articles. There's actually quite a bit of technology that goes into this. We undid 2 years of work. The painful part of this is not like 2 years of work from like 2008. This is 2 years of work from 2 years ago. So a project with not a lot of well-defined specifications, as I'm sure many of you can relate. A lot of things were created organically, ended up with a backbone jQuery and CoffeeScript mess. And tons of dumb manipulation and dumb data storage to kind of give you one slice of scariness that was happening. For those of you that can't read CoffeeScript, don't worry, neither can people who actually write CoffeeScript. So, as you can see, lots of finding things in the DOM that belong in models. This is not indicative of Backbone. I want to be clear for any Backbone fans in the room. This is not how you do Backbone, but this is what we were dealing with. So, yes. So I kind of want to talk about why we picked React, not just because it's the new sexy, even though it's not a very good reason. Our DOM updates a lot. We use WebSockets and service workers, and we have over 500 people that are programming stuff into the app, and everybody in real time sees what everybody else is putting into the app. So if a guy in our London office adds an article to the Laker stream, and you have the Laker stream up, you're going to see that relatively instantaneously, within like 2 or 3 seconds. So lots and lots of DOM updating. Reusability and modularity. I'm not going to bore you by showing you the code, but let's just say that if you cut out all the duplicate code that was like, say, 1 line different in a template or had like 1 extra case statement, I could have cut the code base by 50%. There was just a lot of horrible things being done from a reusability standpoint. The other thing is it's really just JavaScript. Some of this is just my own personal bias. I'm not a huge fan of trying to make JavaScript look like other languages. I'm a JavaScript developer. I'm a front-end developer by trade. I like that things are just written in JavaScript. It's also probably a bit of a gut reaction because I was staring at CoffeeScript for the first 3 months I worked here, and no semicolons and tabs meaning thing. No, it just hurt my soul. And most importantly, it's the new shiny. So, everybody's got to use the new stuff. Any Dragon Ball Z fans? 1? No? It's all going to fall on deaf ears. All right, and Redux. So there's a lot been said about Redux. It's actually, as many of you probably know, a very simple library. It's only about 100 lines, which I think is elegant and awesome. It's not trying to be super opinionated. You have a single state tree, but still done in a manageable way by being able to compose reducers. The composition of those reducers feels very much like React, so they kind of go hand in hand. Here at Bleach Report, we absolutely love functional programming. JavaScript's getting there from a functional programming standpoint, but for anybody that's familiar with backend languages, almost all the backend of this is built for uses Elixir, so it's very nice to kind of be able to write in the same style as the front end and the back end. We're huge Back to the Future fans, or at least we thought we were, meaning time travel debugging looked really, really cool. We'll talk about this in a bit, but it sounded really sexy to be able to have somebody dump out the state and be like, oh, we can debug, we'll get right to where they're at. Maybe not. Talk a bit about that. that. And most importantly, Dan Abramoff is kind of awesome. Anybody that's listened to his tutorials, you'll be very familiar with the word to do being said until you want to kind of, yes, he says it in such a wonderful way. But Dan's awesome, and the reason why I point this out is because Dan does a tremendous amount of work to support this library. He's very pragmatic about it, and that was huge. We had a lot of people kind of coming from the Ruby world where DHH is, we'll call it opinionated, and a lot of people are fans of that. He's very pragmatic in the approach in that he understands that like there's a lot of different ways you can use Redux. Not every way is the right way, and he spends a lot of time educating the community on that, and I think that's really important. You'll notice a theme here. I don't like people using opinions. So, awesome. So your current solution to a problem will end up being your future problem that needs a solution. I made this up last night. I was on some pain medications, to be quite honest, but not feeling well. So I may have stole this from somebody, I don't remember. But the gist being, as we were doing this, there was plenty of times where we started and we thought we were doing the right thing, we read somewhere we were doing the right thing, and then we get it done, and it's like, this is a shit show. What the hell did we just create? So just kind of a reminder that everything you do, whether it's a 2-year-old backbone project or somebody who comes in like 2 years from now and is writing everything in Elm, someone's going to look at your past code and be like, what the hell is this? Much like I'm doing now. So I'm just doing this because I know someone will pay it forward later. So I just want to kind of talk about some of the things we came across that either we struggled with or we found some sort of like weird in-between state. The first thing was UI state versus app state, or put things wherever we please. So for any of you that have worked with Redux, Redux being unopinionated doesn't really talk about what needs to go in the store, just that we put things in the store. So we started out putting all our data state and all our UI state directly into the store. We found a few problems with that for us. First, we have a lot of reusable data in our app. So we might have information about an article that is stored in like 4 or 5 different places in the application. Because that stuff either needed to be tied directly to kind of how it was represented in the UI or have like this whole separate block of UI stuff away from it, it felt very strange to kind of have the UI stuff in the store. The second is we wanted to, again, I mentioned we like reusability. So we tend to take that article block and show it in a modal, show it in a tab view, show it in a list view. And if we had to tie UI related to that, that article block may be able to be zoomed in, it may be able to be expanded and play a video. We were going to have to tie its action functionality directly to it, just for stuff that ends up being stuff we would show in the UI, right? I want to say, is this article expanded? Now I'm kind of keeping that in multiple places in the UI just for the heck of it. So there's some good things about this. You get a single place to control your state, which is awesome. You get the full-time travel debugging, which, you know, when you demonstrate it is really cool. But your state is very tied to the UI of the app, and there's lots of extra state to manage, which from a if you structure properly performance-wise, it's not a big deal, but mental bandwidth-wise, there's just a lot of extra stuff to go through. So separation of concerns, no, not HTML and CSS. But this is putting your UI state in the components themselves. So if I want to know if a modal is open or closed, I store that directly in the modal component itself. This allows components to be much more modular. So what we do is, if I have a modal, I create a wrapper in a higher order component, which I'll talk about in a bit, but basically allows you to stick any content you want whatsoever directly into the modal. So if that modal has all its own functionality for showing and displaying, then I can use it on 900 different ways. It doesn't care about the state of the store, it just manages all itself directly in there while keeping all the data stuff in Redux itself. This, however, depending on how your app is structured, makes time travel, debugging much less useful, because if I'm like 3 steps into a wizard process with normal time travel, I can jump directly to that step because all that's managed by Redux. If I don't have it managed by Redux, I'm manually clicking through every step because I need to debug some stupid thing in the last step of the wizard. So that part, not so great. There's also a lot of arguments about what goes where. On the surface, that seems like a really clean-cut thing. Like I use a modal example, and everyone's like, yeah, I can't see where you could possibly argue about that. But then you start to get into things that are UI state derived by data, and then you start to get a lot of arguments about whether or not, well, it's derived by data, but yeah, I'm just showing whether or not it's highlighted. So I don't have answers for that anyway, looking for some, but you really have to kind of decide on yourself exactly what you want that to look like. Second one is where to connect, or top down, everyone else is doing it. So This is one of those things where if you go through the Redux documentation, you watch all the tutorials, you listen to anybody kind of bang on about why Redux is so awesome, talk about connecting once at the top while your data flows down. It's the perfect fluxy kind of way of doing things, and everybody's happy. And it can work. Everything you read will tell you to do this way, which means any information you're looking up will tell you that, hey, start top down, here's how you kind of do it. Connect does have some really awesome should component update functionality built into it, so that means you're not writing it directly into your components, so you're helping there. Presentational components are good, that's what they keep telling us, so that allows us to use basically all presentational components. We just have a single container component. It's really challenging to follow the data. This was something we were incredibly sensitive to on the Backbone side, because Backbone, at least in the way it was written here, had very high-level models that were passed way, way down in the app, and you'd spend a ton of time just jumping back through files trying to figure out where the hell stuff comes from. Not fun. And it turns out it's really not the greatest for performance, and I grabbed this little piece from a GitHub issue that Dan Ebermoff was talking about, where there was potentially a lot of overhead with going top-down, because while there is that component should update functionality in there, it's still a shallow compare, so if you get really deeply nested data, you're going to be re-rendering all the way down the tree. If I change a tab somewhere way deep, a lot of stuff's happening up the tree, and it gets pretty ugly very fast. So we can connect all the places. So potentially much more performant. We found it in our case because we do deal with fairly nested data on the article side. When we're dealing with articles and scores, they're just not a good way to flatten out like 900 lines of commentary about a particular game. It's just not easy. Plays really well with higher order components. So you're noticing a theme, I'm going to talk about this a lot. But this allows us to create those modular components, so that article piece that I talked about earlier can connect itself, and it can live wherever I want it to live. It can live inside the modal, it can live inside that list view, and it doesn't matter where it lives. It connects, it gets its own data, and other than worrying about it from a style standpoint, it kind of functions the same way in all places. So it allows me to have just that one article view instead of the 5 article views that all do 90% of what each other does. You're managing a lot more containers. If this is something that makes you nervous, having your kind of map dispatch to procs calls all over the place, huge drawback of this. It is not always easy to figure out where the actions are being triggered, so that you don't have to worry about it. And where is it okay to connect? We have slid up and down the scale of this. We've connected too much, we've connected not enough. It's a constant learning process. Performance and profiling will help you a lot here. We try to reason about it. If this component needs direct access to data and it makes no sense for the next component up to access data, then that's probably the best place to connect. The modal, again, perfect example. I don't want the modal to care about what's inside the modal, but that next piece of content obviously needs to know what it needs to display, so we tend to connect at that level. And advanced composition or impress your friends. This is not something that comes across every day in React, but it's something that's proved to be hugely powerful for us. So I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with decorators. Obviously, hopefully with Connect and Redux is a perfect example of decorator. So super easy to implement. The syntax is dead simple. Anybody who's done prototypical inheritance in JavaScript can write one. Very straightforward. They can be combined very easily. You can stack Connect on top of provider, et cetera, and it kind of does its thing. For the most part, unless you're doing something super funky, they're order independent. It doesn't matter if you throw one beyond the other, as long as you're not writing anything nuts, they should hold up. A downside, and what turned out to be a huge downside for us, is they don't necessarily bring UI on board. Now, I want to be clear, this doesn't mean that we don't use decorators, or this is an either-or discussion. If you don't care about order, you're not doing anything super deep as far as that goes, you don't need any UI tied to what this decorator is going to do, decorators make a whole lot of sense. So there's no reason not to use them. These, you'll notice there's a lot more problems with these, but higher order components bring UI on board. So a higher order component is something where I can literally take, say, a tabbed view that has 3 tabs, and I can put each child component inside that tab view, and that tab view acts as a wrapper. So that tab view can not only just show UI, but it can pass functionality down into its other components. That it only needs to know when it's in a tab view, like is this the current tab, for example. Which, again, goes with that modularity, because that article doesn't need to be any different if it's in a tab. It can inherit that functionality from the higher order component that's passing it down. You need to combine these carefully. So the one downside with this is in a lot of cases you're having to use the clone child method, which if you've done any reading on that is a bit sticky to mess with. It also means that when you chain them together, they don't necessarily work the way that you expect, and if you do them in the wrong order, you can end up just basically completely breaking it. So you have to be very careful about that. They are also much more challenging to implement. You have to do a lot of thinking about exactly how they work. You don't want to end up in a situation where you really could have just used a wrapping component and used a decorator to add a little bit of functionality. You really need to have it in a case where it's kind of context specific. So again, going back to that tab view, like I needed to know that it's the current tab. That's something that I can pass down. If I really just want to show it in a tab, I don't need either of these, and it just becomes your normal wrapping component. I think a lot of people confuse the ability to just wrap components and other components with what higher order components do. The big difference here is you're passing down UI and functionality to the children and cloning them with that new functionality so that they can do something slightly different than the original version did. And the last bonus round, project organization, or bike shedding at its finest. If I counted the hours in which we talked about how we organized our project, I would probably get fired for wasting that many hours on talking about this. As with any other, and this is not specific to React, I want to be very clear, but this is something we found useful for React. So typical vertical and horizontal organization still can work fine depending on the size of your project. We started very early on following atomic design. Has everybody, or at least a good portion, seen Brad Frost on atomic design? Okay. So the concept is you got smaller pieces that slowly build up to make bigger things. So we have atoms, and they tend to be very, very stupid components that make up like the button. We would have an organism that would be the button tied to the input that it searches from, and then we would have an organism that combines that with many others, and then a template that's like the entire page, is the rough outline. It fits React and composition really, really well because you end up with a folder of nothing but atoms, and then you can mix them all together any way that you want. So it makes perfect sense for kind of making these small reusable components. Forms are always the example that I use because we use form elements all over our internal tools. They're all used slightly different ways, but I can use all these as base versions and then kind of compose them up. When you use pure atomic design, it can be very difficult to reason about where things are actually used in the app. If I just have a giant list of atoms, molecules, organisms, even just by a naming structure, without that extra layer of organization, it's really hard to follow where exactly I'm using this. Like if I have this article entry, like where do I use it? I have no idea because I just have a bunch of other views that don't really give an idea of what part of the app they're associated with. It's less a rule set and more a framework. A lot of the arguments around this are not just which one should be used, but what's an atom, what's a molecule, all this is too complex. Somebody on another one of our teams created cell, because we just needed to make this even harder to follow. So we just come up with like all these reasons to try to make it fit. None of those are good or bad. Maybe the cell thing's a little weird. But none of those things are good or bad. You just know that you need to be a bit flexible with it. And then, like I said, lots of just debating about how you structure things, lots of debating about where you want things to go. So we have what is a modified atomic design. Let me kind of show you roughly what it looks like. So not too different in the fact that we have our components folder, we have atoms, molecules, organism, templates. We bust out a few different ones just for sanity's sake. So we have our higher order components. Those are the things that don't necessarily fall in any of these because they're adding functionality and they're quite a bit different. And then we have wrappers, which are just kind of those ones that could be any of the above depending on where we're using them. If I end up making a modal, what is that? Is that an organism? Is it a molecule? It really depends on what level I'm putting it, so we call those out separately. It does buck the trend in a little bit, as in I don't necessarily know how it relates to things in the actions and reducers layer, and it's something we're kind of looking at because it's something we see as a fault. But this at least gives us a way where I have my atoms, but I have my form inputs, my modal elements, my UI elements kind of all put in there. And then as we go up, the descriptor folders get more and more specific. So if I want to see everything related to a stream entry, I can look at that. If I want to see everything related to the article entry, which uses pieces of the molecules, I can do that. And then it's as simple as going into a component in the article entry, you'll see the folders that each one of those components is put inside of, and then you know exactly where it's being used and what parts it's being pulled out of. So that's definitely something where we're still kind of tweaking it, trying to figure out where exactly we need to put it, but yeah. And just a reminder for anybody that is salty about anything that I said, they're all just opinions. I'm probably wrong about at least half of this. So I just wanted to kind of, and I'll be frank, this is purposely pulled out to look a little bit more simple than it actually is, but just to kind of give you an example of how this works. So this is a higher order component in what would be a tab view. So I have a list of tabs across, and I have content that I need to show inside of those tabs. And when you compose it, you're basically just passing in children, and those children get rendered inside of it, just like you would with normal composition. The difference, and let's see if this actually works. We'll see how many changes I made before the presentation. If you wanted to pass functionality down to it, you can use this React clone element. You can add anything to it as you clone it, and then it gets all that additional functionality. And you'll notice what we're doing is up here, we're not using React, or I'm sorry, we're not using Redux to show the current tab. We're just keeping that in the component itself. So it's able to take that current tab key, pass it down to the children, and the children will just do a match themselves with the functionality that we add to this higher order component to basically determine whether or not it's the current one and then show itself if it is. Cool. So that's it. Questions, comments? I always regret asking if there's any questions or comments, but all means please, yes.
You mentioned like when you're using decorators, it's like not for anything UI specific. What are some like use cases that you're like, oh, that's a perfect decorator?
Yeah. So one of the challenges with form inputs, as I'm sure everybody knows, form inputs in general are just like not always fun in React. So one thing that happens a lot is we have these large text fields where writers are writing articles, and we are updating things on debounce roughly every key press because there's other things in the UI that are updating. If they start in the middle of a line and start typing, the cursor will jump all over the place. So we have a very simple decorator that adds the functionality in the before component updates and after component updates lifecycle methods to determine the current cursor position, store it, and then when it re-renders, throw it back in there. So we're not attaching any additional UI to it, but we're able to just connect. We call it cursor stabilizer. That's what you call it. And then we can throw that around any text input, any text area, and it keeps the cursor in place. We also do something similar for title casing. We have fields that we need a title case. It's a similar functionality. Before the component actually updates, we go through and we actually title case what's in there. Again, no UI involved, but something that's a simple decorator.
You talked about how you may have, say, like an article that needs to know about itself all over the place in multiple different areas.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't sure about where to store its information. Have you thought about doing anything like a sort of model that can be watched, if you will?
Yeah, so basically what we have now, so before when we had the UI model and everything was so tied to UI, that was a problem we ran across. And how we solved it was basically, we now have an article part of the store, and anything that needs to know about the article, because we connect in quite a few places, connects directly to that article itself. So it's essentially that same kind of functionality where all those components, the 5 or 6 of them that need to know about the article, can all connect to that single piece as opposed to a bunch of slightly different versions of the same data.
Any other questions for Brian? Nope, okay.
Thanks.